You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Well, hey there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda. Welcome to episode 111 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. Today, my stories are about bookstore nastygrams and Ouija board sacrifices. But first, I think we need to get a little comfortable with some bourbon. I have Noah's Mill in my glass today, so what do you say? Join me in a toast. Cheers, y'all. All right, bourbon. That'll wake you up. So this Noah's Mill is a small batch blended bourbon. So that means it's anyone's guess what's in the mash bill. What I can say for certain is that it has a very high proof of 114. So yeah, it's potent. Oddly, it smells sweeter than it actually tastes. You roll it around in your glass a little bit, and it kind of has a little bit of a rum sort of scent. But then you take that sip, and it's dry, a little tobacco-y, and then you get this massive burst of cinnamon. Then it rounds out, you get some hazelnuts, a little bit of mint at the back, and it's quite nice. Potent, but nice. And I really like the oily consistency of it. I feel like that just makes it all the more fun to roll around in your mouth and savor. I will say, a little bit of water is going to really bring out the creamy flavor, and it's going to take some of that alcohol heat out. But here's my biggest complaint about this bourbon. For $50 a bottle, I'm not quite sure it's worth the price point. Unless you want to pay those extra dollars for the high proof. Quite honestly, I'm not saying this is a bad bourbon, but I would be more inclined to go with one of my standbys, like Russell's Reserve 10-Year, which has a much better price and it has somewhat of a similar flavor profile. Noah's Mill is good, it's really good, but it's definitely overpriced. Now that I'm feeling warm, I need to let y'all know that I received a nastygram. Now, this in itself isn't such a big deal. Hate mail is always a part of the territory when you do anything in public. Whether it's writing a book, releasing a song, or, throwing a podcast out there. But this letter wasn't exactly hate mail. It was really more like a cease and desist letter written by a self-righteous hobgoblin who's watched one too many episodes of Law and Order. And it's from, of all places, a bookstore. I'm not really in the habit of angering bookstores, particularly independent bookstores like this one. In fact, I go out of my way to support all bookstores, and especially independent ones at that. Except this one. When it comes to this bookstore, I can't say that I would be all that concerned if a plague of frogs descended on it and drowned the owners in a tidal wave of neon yellow frog piss. To say that I detest them is an understatement. But I suppose I should explain. Several years ago, as you may or may not know, I published my first book. Now, as a first-time author, my publisher had absolutely zero interest in sending me on a book tour, which I totally understood and responded accordingly with, "Fine, fuck you, I'll book my own tour." I'm sure my overworked agent had a good laugh when I said that, knowing full well just how hard it can be to sell an established author, let alone some wacky chick out of Chicago whose only claim to credibility was a broken heart and a box full of crumpled backstage passes. But y'all, if there is anything that I have learned in all of my misadventures, it's that you don't get what you don't ask for. With the right pitch, me and my guy worked our asses off to convince Barnes & Noble and Borders bookstores across the country to host book signing events. Really, there was no risk on their end. All they had to do was order books, and whatever they didn't sell, my publisher would buy back. The real work, the hard work, the sweat, the crying, the beating our heads against the wall, that came from getting people to show up. And after doing that, I will tell you, I get why publishers are so reluctant to put energy behind new authors. It is a hard sell. Think about it. people aren't exactly inclined to read. And even if they are, they're not necessarily willing to go out of their way to do it. And even fewer people than that want to actually go to a bookstore to meet the writer that they've never heard of. So to combat that, we kind of turned our book tour into a rock and roll event, complete with backstage passes and giveaways, and the gimmick worked amazingly well. But not every appearance I did was a winner, like my signing at the Barnes & Noble Las Vegas store. Looking back, my optimism in thinking that I could make an impact in Vegas seems downright adorable, if not slightly delusional. Because, let's face it, if given the choice between strippers and slot machines, or making awkward conversation with a writer, what are you going to pick? Because I know where I'd be, and it wouldn't be at an off-strip bookstore. Which I am sure Barnes & Noble knew when they booked me. So I will to this day appreciate the fact that they did their best to promote the event. My table was situated in the impulse buy section of the store, because clearly I did not qualify as actual literature. Cafe was off to one side, and behind me was a display of children's books and games. So for the entire duration of the signing, to which approximately 3 people came deliberately, I had to field questions about the location of the bathroom and fend off unattended children trying to get at the Lego sets behind me. The rest of the time, I stared off into space, wondering why I didn't do something useful with my life. I'd say that you could hear crickets chirping, except that they were drowned out by the sound of the cappuccino maker. And my guy did his best to hustle or just threaten people into stopping by my table, but it really didn't do that much good. We sold maybe 6 books that day. But to the store's credit, they never returned a single unsold book to my publisher. So who knows? Head on over to the Vegas Barnes & Noble and you may just be able to find a very dusty copy of my book on the clearance rack. Despite that one unfortunate event, the tour overall was incredibly successful. So when it came time to wrap it up, we thought it would only be fitting to hold our end-of-tour event at one of my favorite indie bookstores in Illinois. Oh, I had always loved this bookstore because they supported upcoming writers. Every time I went in, I would see an entire wall dedicated to new writers and local talent, and I had always hoped that one day I would see my book on those shelves. And better yet, it wasn't a chain store. So if there was any store that would understand the struggle of an upcoming author and the fight that goes into supporting a first book, I assumed this would be the place. Let me be clear, and I cannot stress this enough. I never expected them to roll out a red carpet for me. And quite honestly, I was willing to supply them with a couple of test books and let them keep the profits. That's how important it was to me to be on their shelves. So we had a goal. Now, my guy set out to make this happen. Every couple of days, he'd give them a call, leave them a message, send them an email. And it took more than a month just to get one of the owners on the phone. And when my guy finally did, he could barely get his pitch out before this dickhead says, "We're aware of your book." Can I just pause here and call out how colossally dismissive and just plain assy it is to say, "Oh, we're aware of you." I mean, you might as well just come out and say, "Yeah, I know you, and I fucking hate your guts." Which was exactly what this bookstore told us, though not quite as explicitly. Essentially, they had become aware of me back when I wrote a Sex and the City-style column for the local Sun-Times affiliate. The column wasn't really that much different than this podcast, but it did generate a fair amount of controversy with my local wingnuts, who just couldn't handle the thought of a single girl writing about having sex in their little town. Apparently, this kind of content just wasn't what the owners wanted in their independent bookstore, but thanks for asking. It's their bookstore. They can carry whatever fucking books they want. Never mind the fact that the front of their store sports a large sign boasting, "We love local writers." I guess I'm just not worthy of their love. Which was fine. We wound up booking an event at another Borders bookstore instead, and it was awesome. It's been a few years since all of this went down, and in that time, I have not stepped foot in that independent bookstore, and I have no intention of doing so ever. Although I will add that every time I see the front window and their obnoxious "We Love Local Writers" sign, I'm kind of tempted to hurl a box of my books right at it. Beyond that, however, I haven't given this store much thought until I received their Nastygram. According to their little love note, it would seem that an individual or individuals have been allegedly plastering the store with my podcast stickers. They're popping up in all sorts of unexpected and inappropriate places. On shelves, the bulletin board, the bathroom wall, which really, if there was any place that my sticker belonged, it would be there. And every time they manage to scrape one sticker off, a new one appears in its place. Isn't that odd? Look, y'all, I can say with all honesty, I have no idea who's doing this sticking. It sure as hell isn't me or my guy. And I definitely, absolutely do not condone, what did they call it? Hang on. Oh yes, they called it flagrant destruction of property. Of course that's bad. I would never suggest anybody do that. But I will say this much. It does give me just the slightest bit of satisfaction that this store is once again aware of me. And to that, I say, cheers, y'all. Let's have some bourbon. Oh, God damn it, that's good. So I don't know if y'all noticed, but last month I posted a poll on Twitter asking if you thought my guy and I should use a Ouija board this month. I did it mostly to prove a point to my guy, which was even if a person doesn't necessarily believe in ghosts or some sort of spiritual beyond, they will still avoid playing with a Ouija board on general pop culture principle. Sadly, y'all are a bunch of diabolical asshats who overwhelmingly voted that we should break out the spirit board. What's more, you gleefully added that you couldn't wait to hear about what kind of gateway to hell we managed to open up in our living room. Thanks for that. Anyway, the results did prove my point. At least in that y'all were way more happy to sacrifice us to Captain Howdy than yourselves. Well, I hate to break it to you, but we most definitely will not, under any circumstances, be using a Ouija board this month or ever. And if you want to blame anyone for this disappointment, you can blame my mother. I discovered a Ouija board in my mom's closet when I was about 7, and at the time I was thrilled. But before I could test it out, I saw the movie The Exorcist, and that changed everything. I really couldn't explain why, but the movie affected me on some inherent level. I was both perversely fascinated and unrepairably terrified by it. So much so that I decided to take a very Smokey the Bear approach to preventing demonic possession, and I immediately stole that Ouija board from my mom's closet and buried it in the far reaches of our basement. You see, although I had to that point been exposed to two entirely opposing belief systems, that being Catholic school and the ramblings of my quasi-Wiccan mother, both seemed to agree wholeheartedly on one thing: that there was indeed evil in the world, and, as I concluded, it could very likely find you and eat your soul. At the impressionable age of 7, and lacking the tools of logic that I have since acquired, I believed 100% that Ouija board was the literal key to the other side. Burying the spirit board was easy enough. My mother, not so much. My mother is something of an enigma. She's completely pragmatic, slightly sadistic, and oddly spiritual. She also sees dead pets. And she's fairly bitter about this, as if the specters of our pets' past have nothing better to do in their afterlife than deliberately plague her. I don't see what the problem is. I mean, aside from the whole my dead pets are haunting me thing, it seems to me that a ghost cat would be less trouble than my mother's alive and biting ones, but what do I know? She's been seeing dead things for as long as I can remember. And while I'm not above conceding the existence of the supernatural, I am inclined to ask my mother to pass the crack pipe. Somehow, seeing Princess Aura, our dead Siamese cat, playing hide-and-seek under the kitchen table is just a bit too fantastic to let pass. That being said, though, my mother thought my Ouija board fears were ridiculous. That's why, every so often, I would come home from school and find it sitting on the coffee table or on the desk in my bedroom. I suppose my mother figured that if I saw the board enough, I would get desensitized to what I thought it represented. But that, coupled with her choice of china, only solidified my conviction that our home was one step away from being a conduit to Pazuzu. You wouldn't think to look at it that my mother owned the devil's china. The pattern was obnoxious in a 1970s sort of way, and covered with something like a floral pattern. It was ugly, yes, but nothing to sprinkle holy water over. Except for the fact that it was also the same china used in The Exorcist. Oh, yeah. Now, obviously, we weren't using movie props at home, but it was the exact same pattern and pieces. I noticed it the first time I saw the movie. And picture it. There I was, slack-jawed, bug-eyed, and repeating, "It's only a movie," as I rocked back and forth on the couch, when I came face to face with the horrifying connection that the exact same cup I was drinking hot chocolate out of was also in the on-screen hands of Ellen Burstyn. And of course, just one flight of stairs away from her in the movie was a ravaged, screaming, demon-seething Linda Blair, who, as far as I was concerned at the time, may as well have been standing directly behind me, dribbling vomit and holding the matching saucer and serving tray. I think my mother considered that creepy coincidence her own demonic seal of approval. In fact, she had actually stood up in the theater when she and my father first saw The Exorcist in 1973 and announced to the entire theater, "Those are my dishes!" The crowd was too busy fainting and crying and covering their eyes to much care, but with me, she had a new audience. So no, she had no intention of throwing the china set away. She would not donate it to charity, and if I wanted water at bedtime, I'd drink it in the mug she gave to me and like it. Oh, it was so horrifying. I would eye that miserable china mug in the twilight of my bedroom, perched ever so close to the Ouija board, and spend the entire night freaking the fuck out. I would go off to school the next day a twitchy mess. And it wasn't long before I was regularly performing the rites of exorcism on my dolls, just in case. Perhaps it was finding my favorite doll fastened to a wooden pinball game, arms and legs roped to the frame with pink ribbons after a recent exorcism, that prompted my mother to announce that she had had enough of my nonsense. So she sat me down one day and explained that evil only has the power you give it. She was concerned that I was going to grow up scared of things that I apparently had the power to control. And to prove her point, she insisted that we sit down and use that damn Ouija board. My mother was big on the power of the self. And I don't know if that was a product of the 70s or her Wiccan readings, but she had recently started teaching me little tricks to help me control the nightmares that I was having. So I figured that if she could help me bring order to my dreams, then maybe she could help me conquer my waking fears too. So that night, she and I sat down in the living room, cross-legged with the Ouija board resting on our knees. We pretty much had the house to ourselves that night. My dad was off teaching college, and my sister, who was probably about 2, was fast asleep. We didn't light any candles, there was no lightning outside, no storms from hell, and we didn't plead for the spirits to send us a sign. We just placed our fingertips on the planchette and started gently moving it in a circular motion around the board. I was petrified. Oh, y'all, I was just scared out of my mind. My hands were visibly shaking, and my eyes kept darting around the room. I'm not sure what I expected to see, but I was braced for anything. Linda Blair, Pazuzu, or perhaps Ebenezer, the snapping turtle that I had buried in the backyard that summer. My mother was calm as could be. She smiles at me, as if to say, "You see, nothing is happening. There's nothing to see here." And the room was completely normal. Out the window, I could see our neighbors in their home sitting around their kitchen table. The room was still and quiet. There was nothing vibrating, nothing being knocked off the walls. And I felt a little silly, but I wasn't entirely buying it. So I tell my mom, "We're doing it wrong. We have to ask a question." She sighs. "All right," she says. "We'll ask a question." She begins to speak then, and she's using her mom voice, the one that could stop a hand mid-reach into the cookie jar without ever getting loud. She tells me to picture white light, lovely radiant light filling the room. She says that the white light is full of happy thoughts and good feelings, and tells me to start thinking about my favorite song. At the time, it was The Rainbow Connection from the Muppet movie, and that made me smile. My hands stopped trembling a little bit, and I feel myself start to ease. And the room is still quiet. We still have our fingertips on the planchette, and we're circling it around, and honestly, I started to feel good. I wasn't seeing rotating heads or pea soup anymore, just Kermit the Frog and his trusty banjo singing a song on a log, surrounded by that white light. My mother interrupts the silence then, and she says her name, sort of like an introduction of sorts. And then she asks, "Would anyone like to say hello to us?" Our fingertips are still barely touching that planchette as we move it around the board. The room is still. My thoughts are calm. And then the smoke alarm goes off. Wild beeping interrupts everything. It's rude and almost vulgar hearing this crazy beeping noise interrupt this calm that my mother had created. And she jumps up in a panic. And I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. So she says, "Just stay here, stay here." And she runs into the kitchen, and I am frozen in my spot. The beeping is incessant. I hear all sorts of rustling in the kitchen. There's a chair being dragged across the floor. More commotion, some swearing. Then everything just goes dead quiet. I'm not sure what to do. There's this weird sort of current going through the room. It didn't feel dangerous, but it definitely didn't feel settled. I look down and see that the Ouija board is upside down on the floor. I'm not sure what exactly, dare I say, possessed me to do this, but I picked up the board. I placed it on the coffee table, and then just very deliberately slid that planchette over to the word goodbye. My mother comes back into the room, and she looks very relieved, but a little wild, too. She has the smoke detector in her hand, and I can tell she's doing her best to try and make me feel good about this, to try and soothe me a little bit, and she explains that maybe the battery in the smoke detector was low. Maybe an insect crawled across it and set it off. But either way, she says, there's nothing to worry about. She didn't acknowledge the Ouija board then, or where I'd placed the planchette, but I did catch sight of kind of an odd little smile on her face when she glanced at it. Instead, she just took me by the hand and suggested that we make some popcorn and watch the Muppet movie. After that, y'all, the Ouija board stopped making random appearances in the house. My mother eventually upgraded her china set, too. And for this, I am eternally grateful because while I came to appreciate The Exorcist over time, I never could get used to those damn dishes. They remain packed in the basement where they belong, alongside some worn scratching posts and cat beds that my mother refuses to throw out. The spirit board, well, I lost track of that a long time ago. but I think it's a safe guess that my mother knows exactly where it is. And that, y'all, is where it's going to stay. And on that, y'all, I just want to say thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Unwritable Rant podcast. Head on over to theunwritablerant.com if you want to find out more about the show and me, or maybe buy some of our fantastic podcast swag. You can also connect with me on Twitter. I am @morningneurosis. If you've ever had any experiences with a Ouija board, I would love to hear about them, so send them my way. Otherwise, y'all, I'm going to have some more bourbon and find some more trouble to get into. I'll be back next week with more bourbon-soaked stories. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablerant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter @morningneurosis.
Girl, you as pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, a couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton relay. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.